Welcome back. In this video, I'd like to talk about one more experimental way of binding the keyword this. So if you go to the React documentation, you'll see they use the explicit binding using .bind inside of the constructor for almost all of their examples. But they do have a little note that says, if calling bind annoys you, there are two ways you can get around this. And the second one is one we've already discussed, using the arrow function and the callback inside of the render method inline. And we talked about why that's not a great idea. They also go over it here. However, there's another option they mention, which is to use the experimental public class fields syntax. Notice they say if you are using the experimental public class fields syntax, you can use class fields to correctly bind callbacks. So when they say experimental, basically they're referring to some features that aren't quite integrated into the specification just yet. So there are different stages for, and this is something I honestly don't know all that much about, but there's different stages for new features, different pieces of JavaScript to be integrated into the spec. There's something called strawman, stage 0, then there's the original proposal, then stage 2 is the draft stage, and then candidate stage, and then finished stage where something is actually included into the standard. So the thing that they're referring to in the documentation, the class field syntax, is currently at stage 2, which means if you tried to use it just in your browser, you're going to have a bad time. It's not going to work. What we can do, thanks to Babel and Create React App, is use it here and then just let Create React App take care of it for us and convert it into code that does work. So this is what it looks like, just to show you here, right here. When we define our click handler, like handle click, we use an equal sign and then parens and then an arrow function. And inside of that, we do whatever sort of logic we want. And the value of this will refer to the component itself, even though we didn't explicitly bind it anywhere. So this syntax is used pretty commonly in React applications, even though it is experimental, because of the ubiquitousness of Babel and Create React App. So if we come over here and just test it out, I have a new component called experimental square, and I'm going to refactor dispense wisdom. So down here, I'll leave this the same. I've removed, I can actually get rid of the constructor entirely. I've removed what we had up top where we actually bind it manually, and instead when we define dispense wisdom, we'll add the equal sign and the arrow function and save. And if we just verify, it should be working still, or it should be working. It wasn't working before, and this is now set to the value of the individual experimental square component. So that is working. But to show you what actually is going on behind the scenes, if we go to Babel and you click on the try it out now, if we define a class, whatever we want to call it, class cat, and then we add in a class property using the syntax I just showed you, like handle meow. We set it equal, and then our function, and inside of here, let's just do something like console.log meow, something like this. You'll see that it doesn't like what I'm doing. At least with the options I have checked right now, there's an error at this equal sign. However, if I enable stage 2, this is what it's spitting out at the end of the day. Class, and it's adding a constructor, and inside the constructor, what do you know? It is binding handle meow in the constructor. So this is just a nice, easy way of doing this, but keep in mind it is experimental. It means that we're relying on Babel to take care of it for us, and that you couldn't just use this if you weren't using Create React App with Babel and all of that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. So I want to introduce it to you. Experimental doesn't really mean that it isn't going to work because of the way that Create React App works anyway. We're just spitting out JavaScript at the end, so it's not going to be a problem. Personally, I don't know how I feel about it. You'll see it all the time. I still like explicitly binding because it's clearer. I don't like mixing these class properties and then having regular methods on here where we're not using this syntax. But at the end of the day, this is a nice short syntax, and it solves the problem of binding down here using an arrow function because we're only binding at one time. We're not continuing to rebind it every time we call render. So it's up to you. If you want to use this, absolutely feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to be sticking with binding in the constructor, but honestly, it is a personal decision, just about as personal as naming your own child and deciding to get married or not. Okay, so there was a lot to talk about around binding. At the end of the day, you need to bind. It's up to you how to do it, but there are two ways that prevent some of those performance issues. So binding in the constructor and using the experimental syntax.